path in our study through the Old Testament book of Psalms. We're going to pick up today, I should say, at Psalm 55, and we'll get to probably 3 or 4 of them. And what you'll notice in this, there's a real similarity to many of the Psalms that are already here. And I want to make sure that we're careful not to think somehow that it's just a redundant kind of a theme. But the more that I think about this, and I find it kind of a fascinating thing to consider, you might think of the life of a king or somebody in this kind of a position to be kind of a carefree type of a thing. You know, you're at the top of your particular part of the world, and really there's nobody that is above you as far as authority would be concerned, at least if we're thinking in the human sense. You don't answer to anyone in the earthly sense. And of course, it would be different as far as David, because he answers to the Lord for sure. But you would think that that would somehow insulate you from worry and concern. And yet, we find so consistently in David's writing the trouble that he felt of heart and of mind, and how often he felt or even realized it was an absolute truth that there were people that looked to do him harm, some people that wanted him dead, displaced, removed, however you want to put it. And you're going to find that that's pretty consistent here, though it's not as though he's saying the same things over and over about one event. What it tells us is that there are a number of events that he had obviously gone through in his life, and we have a record of a lot of those when we read through Samuel, and we get the discussion of him, or in Kings when his reign is also mentioned there. But if you were to just read through, let's just call those the historical books, if you read through those just of his life from the beginning until the end of it, you get a chance to see that there were a number of things that caused him a great deal of trouble. And if you've studied through those, you'll also notice that from the time, and something that we studied a few weeks ago, that from the time that he had the sin with Bathsheba, after that, things became much different for him as a king. It created a great deal of strife in his household. And as we were studying through that, when we were going through the books of Kings and of Samuel, I think I made mention of that, and that really created so much trouble and distress because of his almost an unimaginable thing that he did, and the sin that he had fallen into created incredible strife for the rest of his life. And so as you study through those things, you kind of get a chance to see that. But here we get an opportunity also to notice that as David talks about the things that he does here, there is a great deal of trouble in his heart and mind. And it wasn't, from everything that you read here, there doesn't seem to be a lot of I guess you could say, peace, and even if you would, tranquility in his life. But there was in his spirit, interestingly enough, or that's at least what you can see from it, that even when he's confronted by all of these enemies and the things that they propose to do to him, and that God kind of tips him off to, and that God also preserves him through, at the same time you realize that it's because of that dependency on God that doesn't overwhelm him. And it's because of that he's not destroyed. I'm convinced of it anyway. So when we read through these, again, this is the thing that we'll find when we get into Proverbs as well. Because of what we would almost consider a repetition. You hear something that is said that's very similar somewhere else inside of the same book. I hope that we don't just rush right through it and say, as though it's something that there isn't a specific to it. And in the front of many of the Psalms, or at the beginning of it, you'll notice that it gives what is attributed to why something was written. Again, it's not something that would be in the actual psalm itself. Most people would believe it was added in at a much later time, but that was what the tradition and the history would have held, that this is what was going on, but it's not incorporated into the thoughts themselves. So it's like a book. You might have the title of a book, and then yet that title doesn't find its way into the actual writing of the book. It's kind of that type of a mentality. And so there's different people view it different ways, that they were titles that were given later and attributing a particular event that had precipitated the actual writing, or if it was something that was already attached to it and it just was handed down through the generations. Again, there's a lot of there's a lot of views, or there are a number of views of how we got the information. But if we just take what's there put before us, there's no reason to not believe it. When it doesn't tell us for sure, and we'll have one of those examples here, what was the event that really made David say these things? Some of them we don't know, and yet it's a pretty interesting thing to see David say some of the things that he does. And I think we can kind of take it away from this. As far as a king, somebody like this, as far as David is concerned, I think that there would be additionally more pressure brought on him than really any other king that there would be, because of who he is and because of the nation that he is a part of, and because he's really the man that ultimately God chose after the nation had chosen Saul. And so the idea that there would be this, in a spiritual side, the devil doing everything possible to try to at times entice him, to have him taken out, anything that it could do, or that the devil could do that would hurt the nation, would certainly be a high priority for him. And so, especially when this is a man who was careful about how he represented God before the people, when so many of the other kings didn't. So I think there would be more pressure brought against him than just about anybody else for those reasons specifically, in addition to just the fact of man's ambition of wanting to take out the ruling person and try to make them that way. Sometimes it was from within his own house and with his own family, Absalom. Or at other times it was people outside of it, people that acted out of sheer jealousy and out of real paranoia, like Saul. There's just a lot of examples of it that you can see. But I just find it interesting that when you read through these, you just see this is a repeating thing with him. So often through his life, him crying out about the people who looked to do him harm in one way or another. But you'll also notice that he's very careful at side by side with this. It's not a psalm where he's just going to complain about a bunch of stuff. He will lodge what you would call the concerns, the complaints, the worries, the cares, the fears, and at the same time, the recognition that he is dependent completely on the Lord, and he proclaims it as such. So the people will be reading this, and again, many of these were put to music. It would be a song written about life experience that he has, and he would mix those two things in. These people who look to do me harm, yet my trust was in God. And so, when it comes to that, this is why the Psalms can be really wonderful in the application sense. We never want to just think that David is writing these things thinking, 3,500 years down the road, or 3,000 years down the road, I should say. And then somehow think that it doesn't have anything to do with him at the time. It has everything to do with him and his life and the encouragement that he might have for the people that are reading it or hearing the music. But also we can say, and God preserved it all these years later, that we would have a way to look back and say, man, I can identify with that. Those people that would look to do me harm are like the ones that look to do him harm. What did God show him? What was his state of mind? What was his way of looking at the Lord and saying that no matter what is happening here to me in this life, it is the Lord who is the one who comes to my assistance and my aid. It's to him that I cry out. And in case I forget to do it as we come to some of the passages, let's always remember, as we're reading these things, it almost looks as though he's saying, God, you must do these things, or do these things as though it's somehow a command. Let's remember that these are written more in the way of petition. And so when he says, God, come to my assistance, or something like that, or along those lines, come to my assistance, it's not a demand. It's, you can read it just as easily, Lord, would you come to my defense? He realized he can't order God around. It's more of a cry of the heart asking that God would do this thing, but it can be read as though it's a statement or a command when it's actually more of a request. And so very good thing for us to remember as far as prayer. Many of these things could be seen as prayerful as well. And we don't make demands of God. We can make requests known, seeking his will, but God does not answer to us in a way that we order him around. But he does definitely want to hear from us. There is no doubt about that. And it is for us to lay these things before him and trust him, as we will hear David talk about. But then we need to move on from there. And I find a lot of people make this mistake when they say, I'm going to trust this to God, and they deliver something over to him in prayer. God, I'm anxious about this, 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 and this. And they hand it over to him, as they would put it. And immediately they go back to worrying about the exact same thing that they just said that they've entrusted to the Lord. Well, that's like giving something and then grabbing it right back to them. And there's a passage that's really good for this in the book of Philippians in chapter 4, when he talks about that, be anxious for nothing, but in all things with prayer and supplication and thanksgiving make your requests known to God. Well, that's what we're supposed to do. And then the promise is that the peace of God will guard your heart. And that's great. And then after that is when he says, but, now think upon these things. And so whatever are, and then there's that list of things that are there. What that should help us to understand is the recognition that if I'm going to give something and say, I'm anxious about this, Lord, I entrust it to you, do I keep my mind focused on what made me anxious as though I have offered it to the Lord and say, help me with this? What he's saying is if you're going to do that, you're right back in the same problem. How about I occupy myself and my thoughts with something different? And so let me think upon those things that are good and are noble and are trustworthy, those types of things. If I want to be careful about having my mind occupied with something, it shouldn't be on the things that cause me distress. It should rather be on those things that I've watched God do that are just worthy of praise and worthy of recognition because they are good and right. So in this, you kind of get an idea that David understands that to some extent, as much as he can, not understanding what we would understand from a Christian's viewpoint, that we look to the Lord, and our relationship with God is different than what David would have had, because we're saved. We have Messiah as the one who has saved us, and we have the Holy Spirit who leads us and guides us. We've been regenerated in the spiritual sense, alive to God in a way that David couldn't have fully understood. So really, really cool stuff. Now, Psalm 57, let's go there. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the time that we can spend in your word. It is our desire to grow in our understanding of you, and that we would know as we read these things that it is a history of 3,500 years, and yet at the same time, or 3,000 years, it's at the same time, it is for us to recognize the things that we can be taught from this. How can we make proper application to what we read? May we not get stuck in what might seem to some as redundancy, but to realize that these things happened at different times in David's life, and he cries out to you from one time to the next, that he continues to depend upon you, though the pressures and the people coming against him seem to be a never-ending wave. May we learn from this, Lord, and never become discouraged, knowing that you are always before us. So we give you all thanks and we give you all praise, and ask that you would guide us by your Spirit in our study of your word, in Jesus' name. All right, so 55. He says this, and again, remember I had mentioned about giving God demands. This is not demand. This is more said in a way of desire. Lord, will you please make this so? Give ear to my prayer, O God, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Attend to me and hear me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan noisily because of the voice of my enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked, for they bring down trouble upon me, and in my wrath in wrath they hate me. So this is, you're never going to be able to tell something to God that he doesn't know. But what this already begins to tell us is that David is in one of those places of distress. This is not one of those psalms that is like from beginning to end a prayer of thanksgiving or a proclamation of I give thanks to you, or any of those types of psalms. This is one of distress. David is in distress because of these people, and so he begins this by saying, God, come to my assistance. Hear what I am saying to you. Make your ear open and attentive to what I'm saying. So give ear to my prayer, O God, and don't hide yourself from my supplications. As I lay out the specifics of this, may they not be hidden from you, or don't remove yourself from it. Now, at the same time that David would say this, I don't think for a moment that you would ask him, do you really think that God would hide himself from you, David? It's not one of those things that's said in a way of uncertainty, but rather of assumption that you won't do these things. I bring them before you as already accepted, and I already believe that this will be the case. So he says, attend to me and hear me, and here's the condition of heart. I am restless in my complaint and I moan noisily. That means, if we've ever been to that place where we're so overwhelmed by things that we just cry out, like, I can't believe this, or however we might express that. It's a way of expressing of the heart in a way that's verbal. And in this case, he says noisy, or it's amplified in some kind of a way, that exasperation. Verse 3, because, and here's why. It's because of the voice of the enemy. What is it that's brought him to this place of complaint and this noisy moaning and the when will it be over kind of a thing? He says it's because of this, because of the voice of my enemy, or of the enemy, and it's because of the oppression of the wicked, for they bring down trouble upon me, and in wrath they hate me. So again, it's one of those things. What is it that's the cause? This is one of those that the attribution at the beginning of it, it doesn't tell us who this is. Now, there are those that would believe that this was at the time when his son Absalom was looking to overthrow him. And let me get the reference for it. It's 2 Samuel chapter 16, starting at around verse 15. And Ahithophel was a person who had access to David, and he's also a person who had access to Absalom. So you can go back and read this again, 2 Samuel chapter 16, starting at verse 15, is where you get what many people think that this is what's being spoken of here. Because what he's about to say means that this isn't just the garden variety person out there, but this is someone who is very close to him that has caused this problem, and that starts to narrow down the list of candidates who could possibly be being thought of here. And so anyhow, he goes on. So he says in verse 4, my heart is severely pained within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. So if this is a situation where it is that's David thinking of somebody like Ahithophel and what's about to happen to him if Absalom were to get his way, then this isn't hyperbolic. David's saying this really is an existential thing. The people who seek to do this, it could be the end of me. And David sees this as, under normal circumstances, it may very well be the case. David is not one of those that's given to, here are my enemies, I'm going to go kill them. But the people who are his enemies would love nothing more than that to be the case. So he says in verse 6, so I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, that I would fly away and be at rest. Indeed, I would wander far off and remain in the wilderness. Have you ever felt like this? So this is David. Once again, if I could just take flight and move away from this would be the end of it. I would be able to leave and just not be bothered with such things. Now, could David have done something like that? Well, I'm sure he could, but it's pretty hard to be able to hide yourself and be anonymous, that words wouldn't get out. And then David also would realize he couldn't go ahead and do that because God has brought him to this place of being the king. And he realizes, because of promises that were made by God directly, that there would be ones who would come from him and from his line that would be in that place of king. And God would give that as a right that would be forever. And so David would realize it would be great. Wouldn't it be great if I could just leave this place and never have to look back? That would be something that he would say would make things so much better, but he realizes it's not something for him. So it says in verse 5, if this would be the case, I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and from the tempest. That would be the ideal, if you will. But look at what he says here, and I want to make sure that we kind of understand as we hear these words to him, or from him. And I know that I've mentioned this a number of times. We're going to come up with some other, in our studies today of the other Psalms, that David looks to his enemies and asks that God completely crush them. And it's an interesting thing when we stop to consider that, gosh, the idea of what Jesus taught us is that even praying for our enemies. And I'm not in any way, and you've heard me say it a number of times, this is kind of where David and I would differ, but I think David looks at the world in a much different way than I do now, because Jesus has changed the way that we view all things, because we've been shown mercy when we were hostile towards God. In this case, there are people who are hostile towards David, and David is saying vengeance. That's where he's at in this point, and it's not the way that we would look at these things, or at least I would hope. Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around in its go around in on it. Go, goodness, I'm so sorry. I'm struggling with reading. Day and night they go around it on its walls. Iniquity and trouble are also in the midst of it. Destruction is in its midst. Oppression and deceit do not depart from its streets. David is recognizing the work that these people are doing is completely subversive, not only against David, but it's brought the whole of Jerusalem into a place of distress and trouble, and everything that they're looking to do just creates havoc and ruin and waste. And it's why David would say this: "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, because then I could bear it, nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide from him." That I would be able to deal with this if it was just somebody who's bringing strife and trouble. Instead, what he sees is this. In verse 13, it says, "But it is you, a man my equal, my companion, and my acquaintance." Now, he has gone from speaking in just the abstract, just the open of things, to now he's able to direct this as though the person who is doing this will be reading this directly. Or it's his way of just making it a singular, making it against a person. So this is where it becomes a matter where you say, wow, now that really narrows it down. Because it is someone who is not just, he would know his enemies by name if they're from foreign countries. He knows the kings that have come against him, the Philistine kings, he knows them by name. This is one, though, that is very near to him and one with whom he has had very close interaction. Because look at what he says. That you are one, a man of my equal, a companion, and my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and we walked to the house of the Lord among the people, or in the throng. Among the people, this was just somebody who was that close to me. So again, this really narrows it down. Ahithophel, is that the person that's being spoken of here? As I had mentioned before, many people speculate this would be the case. Someone who was close to David, but seemed to think that, well, you know, it may very well be that that Absalom is going to overcome his father, and I want to be on the right side of this. So he just makes a calculation, being shrewd. He was wrong, but of course, nonetheless, this is a person who would fit this. So again, the idea that there was just a very close bond and a very close relationship. When you think about the counsel that we shared one to another, that puts it in a very, very small group of men that this could possibly be speaking about. So it says, now, again, think about how we would pray for something like this. Someone who is totally close to us, who does us wrong. In a human sense, we want to say, God, judge them, ruin them, tear them apart. That's human. That's the way that we would tend to do this. Now we would look at a person, I don't care how close they are to you. It's kind of like we want to be able to think, I just thank God I'm not like them. I couldn't think to do to them what they've done to me. Lord, would you show them their error? Would you help them to understand how evil what they have done really, really is? Show them mercy if you've shown me mercy. May they understand what your grace is about, and would you expose to them the evil of what they've done? That's how we should be thinking. Human is a different thing entirely. And as far as David's concerned and his understanding of the law, God would talk about repaying the enemies. But at the same time, we want to remember a guy like Ezekiel was under the law. And so that same time, before the church was and before we understood what grace and forgiveness and mercy looked like, even at that time, God says, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that they would turn. And he's speaking directly to Israel at that point, and or house of Jacob. But it's that's Ezekiel 33:11 where he says that, and that idea that he has no pleasure in the death of the wicked. So we need to remember and balance all those things out. That God is a God of justice, but he doesn't take pleasure in just indiscriminately wiping people out, or just even if they've done what they do because they're horrible, wicked, evil people. God doesn't see that and think, okay, I'm glad because they deserve it anyway. It's not the way he looks at his creation. So, goes on and says this, let death seize them, verse 15, let them go down alive into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. Now, if they're doing all those things, they are worthy of judgment. Absolutely. But aren't we all? Now, That's where it's a little bit different as we think of things in the light of the grace of God. Now, David would be able to say, we all partook in the same thing, and these people have chosen to corrupt themselves. So then he looks to God to say, do what is just and do justice to them. They should be destroyed as enemies against you and against me and against the things of righteousness. So I get where he's coming from, but there is that difference where we can look at the evil people in this world and it would be easy to say, destroy them. And I'll be honest with you, there's a way also to say, Lord, if they will never come to you, you know whether they will or not, and you know that their lives need to be preserved until that time when they reach out to you. But if they will never come to that place, then remove them. And there's a case that can be made for that. Verse 16. As for me, now that's in opposition to who they are, as for myself, as for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord will save me. That feeling, that recognition that if in a righteous sense I cry out to God, this I know, that he will save me, he will deliver me out of these things. Evening and morning and at noon I will pray and I will cry aloud, and he will hear my voice. That recognition that he has, and the understanding that God will always be willing to answer. And we need to remember that as well. As he says that with absolute certainty and confidence, we want to make sure that we understand that is God's nature. Whether we feel it or not, whether we can grasp it in our own minds, none of that really matters. We just need to recognize this is the truth. God will always, at all times, he will always hear. So let's never bring that into question. That's just something that we have to recognize as something that will always be the case. God will always hear. So God will hear, morning and evening. Now, verse 18, he says, he has redeemed my soul in peace and from the battle that was against me, for there were many against me. God will hear and afflict them, even he who abides from old, because they do not change, therefore they do not fear God. This is just an assessment. He's able to look back at his life. This is how it's been. God will do these things because that's in his nature. Now he starts to look at those other people. They may put up a good front, but it's always been in their heart, and it's been that way all along. So that recognition, as he says, because they do not change. The second part of verse 19, therefore they don't fear God. It's just not in them to have any fear or reverence for him. Verse 20, he has put forth his hands against those who were at peace with him. Just speaking of whoever this person is or like him. Those who are like him. They put their hands against those who are right. Those people that if this is, let's say it's Ahithophel. David's done nothing to warrant this. This is a man who has raised himself up against David for his own personal reasons, but not because David has done something to provoke it, which is what David is getting at here. He has put forth his hands against those who were at peace with him, and he has broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were a drawn sword, or they were drawn swords. So whoever this is that he's looking at, again, if it's Ahithophel, he's starting to get to what this man was. He presents himself one way, and yet by his own actions, he's demonstrated that he's an entirely different thing. This gives the impression that David is able to say about these things or about this person after it's kind of come to light that these things have taken place. Again, if it's Ahithophel, you can read about it starting at verse 15 of 2 Samuel 16, and you'll get a chance to read through it if you want to read it. One of the potential historical ones, many people think that it is. So it says this, once again, for a person like David in great distress, what is the remedy? People who I've trusted, who I've spent time with, who are very, very close to me, have raised up against me. And he goes into saying those kinds of things. So where do you find your peace? Because it's one thing to say this. It's another thing to say it because you believe it and because it's really where genuinely your heart is. And I believe that's exactly where David is here. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. Taken over, overwhelmed, moved in the sense of destroyed. David was moved from one place to another. He fled from Absalom, but moved in the spiritual sense, they cannot be conquered spiritually. They can be put to flight in the physical sense. That happened with David here as you read through that part of the history. But it says, but you, O God, you will bring them down to the pit of destruction. Bloodthirsty and deceitful men shall not live out their full days, but I will trust in you. So he looks at this and says, I'll have my trust in you, but because you're just, they will not live to a ripe old age, because you will bring them into judgment. So again, that difference that we might look. And now sometimes we will look at this and think, there are people in our world who are just incredibly evil. They may not know us personally, but the evil things that they do have resulting effect on people who don't know them like us. And we would say, they'll never live out to an old age. Well, sometimes they do. So there are times that David would say these things, and it's more said in the way of hopefulness, but it's not necessarily always going to be the case. So yeah, I think of some very, very wicked people whose things that they do influence the entire world, and it's a world in which I'm a part. And so yeah, there's times that even the most evil of people live to a ripe old age, and the things that they do have consequence to us here and now. Interesting. So in this case, this is one of those, Psalm 56. There are some who believe that this is a time when David would have been at war with the Philistines and been taken back, in this case, to Gath. So again, just kind of the history of it. People think that may very well be the case. David here in verse 56 says, be merciful to me, O God, for man would swallow me up. Fighting all day, he oppresses me. So again, very general statements that are said here. And once again, we could say, yeah, I understand what he's talking about. This is just it is the life of the believer that we're going to face opposition, people looking to do harm. Again, it's magnified in the person of David because of who he is, what is his position. His enemies would be much more wanting to see his destruction because of what it would mean to them on the personal side of things. So my enemies would hound me all day, for there are many who fight against me, O Most High. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. So this is the remedy. What do you do when those times occur? When those people line up and they are your enemies, they come against you. Well, here's his way, how he handles it. What we can learn from this, the application is, maybe I should act as he does, because it's obviously something that he puts a great deal of trust in, rightly so. So he says, whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God, I will praise his word. In God, I will praise his word, or I will give thanks to it. I will give gratitude to God for giving us the promise of his word, something that when we get into those times, we can read what's there for us and find encouragement. So the idea that I would praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not fear. What can flesh do to me? So once again, in the worst case scenario, if I'm even overcome to the point of death, what does that have to do with me? God has overcome death on my behalf. There's a real comfort and a peace. And he's going to repeat those exact same words here in just a few moments. So he says this, all day long they twist my words. All their thoughts are against me for the case of evil. They gather together, they hide, they mark my steps, and when they lie in wait for my life, shall they escape by iniquity? Or because of their iniquity, God, will you allow them to escape? In anger, cast down the peoples, O God. That's his prayer. Now, once again, when you read through these things, the idea that they would take his words, they would twist them, their thoughts towards him are always in that place of evil. This is where you read through the Psalms and you can go, gosh, I've run into that before. I know that that's the case. Once again, I think it's magnified how many times over because of who David is and how many people there are that raised up over the years against him because of who he is, and really spurred on because it's the devil who would want to see a king like David toppled because of the collateral damage that would ultimately do. So this idea that they gather together, they hide, they mark my steps, and when they lie in wait for my life, shall they escape by iniquity or their iniquity? In anger, he asks, cast down the peoples, or in your wrath, which would always be righteous and just all those things are stipulated. Of course, we know that that would be the case. Not that God would have some temper tantrum on behalf of David and just wipe them out. It would be done, David understands this, justly in a judicious sense, if it was to come to pass. So he says, this recognition that God watches these things. You number my wanderings. Put my tears into your bottle, and that they may, and are they not, as he says, in your book? That way of saying you remember all of these things. You take note of them. These are chronicled, if you will. God, you know them to be the case. So it says, when I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. This I know because God is for me. What a wonderful thing to be able to say. So when I will take the time to bring these things before you, and when you act, you will act in a way that is to come to my assistance and do as I'm asking of you, because what I do before you is right, what they do is wrong. And this is just the belief that he has. Now, there are times when bad people will overcome good people for reasons that God knows and the reasons that he does what he does. David has seen in his own understanding, and you can't say that this is just some theological truth, because there are examples when bad people overcome good. Prophet Jeremiah, great example. The oppression that happened to the early church at the hands of those who opposed them. There are cases there where the right people were not on the good side of the outcome. So we can't say that this is a theological truism that good people will always be able to win over bad people. Bad people will never be able to have a victory in things. Not the case. It's not what we're promised. It's not true. What he is able to say, God is for me. That's a truism. Doesn't mean that you'll always be able to escape. But if we start to think of things more from the temporal to the eternal, this we can always say, I will never be overcome. I will never be overcome. God is for me. That is a truism, and it will be proven absolutely to be true when we get into the eternal of things. What happens in this fallen world can sometimes not be favorable to the believer. We need to understand the difference between those things. So it says in verse 12, vows made to you are binding upon me, O God, and I will render praises to you. David obligating himself. The things that I say, I will hold those things true. And God would say the same thing. If God makes a vow to do something, know that he will follow through. We would want to be able to say of ourselves, I, like the God who has vowed to do things on my behalf and for me and in my life, I want to be able to say it the same way. When I tell him I will do something, I would want to follow through with the same vigor that he does. So, for you have delivered my soul from death. This would be the reason why. Have you not kept my feet from falling? That recognition. It's you and you alone. You have never failed to keep my feet from falling, because you promised that you would. That I may walk before God in the light of the living. It's just a statement of truth, that he feels this confidence. So he just again proclaims these things to be the case. So before we go on to the next ones, just again, let's remember we can reset these. If you look at the Psalms that we've already read and the ones that we will, you can say that David's life experience, if you will, people have been, these are just kind of the big picture things. People have found all kinds of ways to try to uproot him and to destroy him and to overthrow him. That's just happened. It's consistent. It's happened through the times. When he trusts in the Lord and he cries out, God comes to his assistance and preserves him. It's just one of those things that he knows, and he trusts that this will be the case. And that, until God is done with our own lives, there's nothing that can really be done. The devisings and the things that man concocts against us will never come to fruit as long as God is still has things for us to do, and that we are under his hand and in his control. God will have these things that we will be able to do. We can always trust him no matter the outcome. But to just remember that as long as we are in this body and God has things for us to do, there's never something that we have to fear. We don't live in that place of fearfulness. And David is, once again, if you read through this and kind of carefully, he understands that if not for God's intervention, they would overcome him. They would overwhelm him. He would be defeated. He would be destroyed. He would be killed. So David does recognize it's God who has done these things for him all along. Our application, kind of the same thing. Knowing that God is for us. not to be surprised when there are those who might raise up against us or look to do us harm. This is a world that, obviously, if they don't know the Lord, there are plenty of people who would want to do us harm because of who we are and what it is that we proclaim to be true. It just comes with the territory. It is a temporary thing. So Psalm 57. This is believed to be something that David would have written as Saul would pursue him, as he did into En-gedi. This is what that same kind of history that we saw. I think it's 2 Samuel 21, 2, 3. That whole time when it's just one thing after another, people raise up against him looking to do harm to him. So this is believed that this is around those same times when Saul had pursued him all the way to En-gedi at the Dead Sea. So it says, "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for my soul trusts in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge until these calamities have passed by." This is something that, interestingly enough, he doesn't lead in this psalm with the troubles, but rather how he deals with the troubles when they come. So really, again, it doesn't mean that there's a pattern to these things. God, here's my trouble, here's what I'm going to do. In this case, this is what I'm going to do in light of my troubles. So again, it's there's not some straightforward, every psalm is going to be laid out in the exact same way. And I think this is kind of the same thing. This just shows the humanity of David and how he is. Because we might be the same way. When we come before the Lord, we may find that in our own prayer, we can come before him with just, here's the problem. In other times, it's, God, I'm so thankful that I can put my trust in you, and I look to you. I ask for your cleansing, your forgiveness. Help me keep my eyes focused on you, remembering that you're the one who is for me, and you know the problems that I'm having because here's what I'm facing. So there's no right or wrong kind of way, because David doesn't have it in a systematic format, if you will, when he prays. It's a man who is troubled with things at a particular time, and he cries out to God and he lays things out. Again, same with us. Prayer is not a formality. I hope that we understand that. And when we cry out to God, again, not a formality. There's not some kind of a script, if you will, or a pattern of how these things should be laid out. Remembering that it is, whenever there's a time when we cry out or pray or do these kind of things, it's just kind of our crying out before the Lord as things come out of our mind and our mouth type of a situation. And David, this is a great example of that kind of a truth. So he says, I will cry out, verse 2, to my God Most High, to God who performs all things for me, or on my behalf, for me. He shall send from heaven and he will save me. He reproaches the one who would swallow me up, and God shall send forth his mercy and his truth. Now, David would only say that because it's all that he's ever known. It's the way that God has always worked in his life, and he has confidence in this. So let's just pause for a moment. There's no reason to rush through this. Let's make sure that we're always at that same place. And again, it's human nature to look at any one particular day, and maybe the trouble on that particular day is more intense than maybe we've seen before, or somehow, some way, it may seem unique. It's always important to be able to come to a complete stop and just say, but you have been so faithful before. I don't want to make it as though this is something that I'm unable to see you overcome for me. Let me be reminded of what you've done, every time in these kinds of things before. I want to be remembering those times when I've been faced with things that are difficult before, and God has overcome them on my behalf. So that is something that I think Christians a lot of times forget. We get so caught up in the things of the moment that we forget that God has been faithful in times past. So best to remember those things. And again, let's remember, even if it's a matter of our own life and whether or not we'll survive a particular thing, nobody is going to be here forever. These bodies were not intended to live forever. So it's best that we be reminded of that and just go, however it is, God will work these things out at the time of his liking and at the time of his decision. It's not for me to take these things upon myself. Let me be careful not to be overly, worn out by these things. Let me be trusting in him. So David would be able to say this: I cry out to the Most High in verse 2, the God who performs all things for me. He shall send from heaven and save me. He reproaches the one who would swallow me up. God will send forth his mercy and his strength. My soul is among lions. It's just the reality. This is a way of using imagery of those who would look to harm him and do him, in this case, it is a threat to his very existence. It's his life that's on the line. And again, if we believe the attribution of this, Saul is pursuing after him, wanting to put him to death as he has done before. So again, David, if he gets the report, Saul's on his way, he wants to kill you. To David, it'd be like, again? So that recognition, this is nothing that is new, and yet he doesn't just fall into panic. Yeah, he tries to remove himself from that place, and at the same time, the recognition, but I trust God even though. And if he didn't trust God, would God preserve him without, would he preserve him anyway? Possibly, probably, because he still has these things that he wants to do in David. But at the same time, it's not to minimize the idea that Saul's the king of Israel. If he wants David dead, David is dead. And so David looks at this and say, would you preserve me? Save me from this. And again, when we read those passages in Samuel, he really very easily could have closed in on David and could have taken him out. And it was the Philistines who caused a dust up, and David escaped from his clutches because Saul had to go the other way. But Saul comes back and he gets all the way to En-Gedi, and that's when David could have killed him and didn't. And Saul is just like convicted of the idea when David says, I could have killed you when you were in that cave. I was there with you, and God delivered you into my hands, or you were delivered into my hands, but I would not lift my hand against God's anointed, recognizing who Saul was. And of course, Saul, oh, I can't believe what a horrible guy I was. I'm so sorry, and I won't do this again. Yeah, you will. Well, he did. So, my soul, verse 4, is among lions, and I lie among the sons of men. It's life. It's the way that these things are. These are people who are set on fire. That everything that they do is incendiary. They just look to consume and burn things up. Whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue is a sharp sword. Now be exalted, O God, above the heavens, and let your glory be above all the earth. So that's who those people are. And these are just the base things of life. They're formidable. They are these people. But he looks to God who is above all of these things. He says this: they have prepared a net for me, a net for my steps. And so that idea that he says here next, my soul is bowed down. I'm pressed. In this case, I recognize who they are. There's a greatness to them. It's not that they're just people who are insignificant and I can easily overcome them. It's the recognition these are people formidable. And so he says, my soul is bowed down, pressed down. They have dug a pit before me. In the midst of it, they have themselves fallen. That, once again, God has delivered them into their own snare. We hear this wording from him in other places as well. So the recognition, if we're people who are reading these things and we see there are people who have laid traps for me, if that's where we are. And it's one thing where David says, but I've watched them fall into their own snares. So is this something that we would pray? Probably not the same way. We wouldn't want to say, I want people to be repaid for their evil. That's what he's basically saying here. Well, I'm watching them fall into the same trap that they set before me. David says it's more in a recognition that I can't possibly, David would be thinking, I can't know in advance what they're planning to do, but since God does, he has had them fall into their own snare. And I think I mentioned this a few weeks back when we were in a similar kind of a verse where Haman is a great example of this during the time of Esther and how he wanted Mordecai dead. And it was then brought to the attention of Xerxes that Haman wanted to kill all of the people, including Esther and Mordecai. And it was Mordecai who brought this to the recognition. And the very same gallows or the same things that Haman had put together where he wanted to see Mordecai put to death, Haman ended up dying on his own gallows. So that idea that the snares of the wicked that they put out, that they're the ones who end up falling on those same snares or in those same snares. That's the thought that's here. So he says, in verse 7, once again, that way of saying, here's who I am versus here's who those people are. My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and give praise. And so he says, awake my glory, or that my soul, that what makes me who I am, my glory, that thing that encompasses who I am. Awake, lute and harp, and I will awake at dawn, or in the early morning. So this way of my gratitude towards you, there are those people who do those things. As for me, and this is a really, really good thing to, I guess you could say, a principle of things. It is easy for us to take offense when people might do things that are awful, that are hurtful towards us. It is normal for us to want to get vengeance for those things. It's just kind of a human nature type of a thing. If we catch what David is doing here, and sometimes he will do that, avenge me, and or the idea that he wants to take it into his own hands, there is those people who do the things that they do, they're your problem. In this case, I need to make sure that here's what I do. Instead of worrying about what they do, I'll bring these matters to your attention. Lord, you know who they are. You know what they desire to do. And there are those times he says, repay them and judge them. He says that whole thing there. And again, Old Testament versus New Testament, we're called to do something a little bit different in what Jesus would say about praying for our enemies, but the recognition that we would want to see them saved. Even if they hate us because they don't understand. We would ask, God, would you open their eyes rather than just judge and ask for judgment. But notice what David is able to do. There are those people who do those things. Lord, have your way with them. He gives some suggestions along the way, but he always does this, as for me. So he says, as for me, if that's kind of the way of saying, my heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. It's not movable. I will sing and I will give praise. So awake my glory, awake the lute and the harp. I will awaken earlier at dawn. I will praise you, O Lord, among the people. I will sing to you among the nations. For your mercy reaches into the heavens, and for your truth into the clouds. That way you're above all these things. I will do these things here on earth. You are above all of those things. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be above all the earth. That recognition of earthly versus heavenly. So when David would say, I will do these things on earth, recognizing that you are above all things. You are above even the earth itself. 58. And this is, once again, look at how David will say these things, that idea of vengeance. Now, vengeance implies wrong done. And to David, there would be plenty of times where wrong was done to David. And David, in his understanding of how God does the things that he does, it's understandable that David would be saying, God, do these things coming to my assistance and to my aid. He's been wronged. He's asking for God's vengeance. So verse 58, do you indeed speak righteousness, you silent ones, these people who do things behind the scenes that people don't see? And this is an accusation that he makes. It's a recognition. It's not an accusation without merit. It's one thing to say something about people, but if they have done things that make it this way, this is David saying and calling people out for what their evil is. So he says, do you speak righteousness, you silent ones? Do you judge uprightly, you sons of men? No, in heart you work wickedness. You weigh out the violence of your hands on the earth. So it's a rhetorical question. Do you do these things? Well, of course you don't, because here are your actions. So verse 2 is really the actions that he is addressing. And again, that's rhetorical in the first part. So it's an indictment against who these people are. And so whatever it may be. Here's what he says. The wicked, and this is just an assessment. These are true things. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. Now, of course, that can't mean when they're born speaking lies. An infant doesn't have the ability to speak. He's just saying from your earliest time that you can, this is just a statement about who they are by nature. This is what they are. And let's remember, all people are this in the way of potential. And I've heard people say, man is inherently good, and it's only when they decide to go astray. Well, that's a fanciful thing, and it's nice to believe that way. But once again, we can find that from early on, people may just be, they just do evil things. And I would say that as far as man is concerned, man at his essence is not good, but evil, and the scripture would tell us that. Because it takes doing things right, things that God would see as good or honorable. It takes an effort. People don't do that just out of the box. Now, there are people who are by nature much more docile, much more easygoing, much more forgiving. But again, those things only happen because of some external force upon them. They just see these things as good and right. They're just a better natured kind of person, perhaps. But left to their own devices, man will do whatever is right as far as they're concerned, and whatever pleases them, they will do. So again, I know people will disagree on that, but that's fine. They can disagree. God would say there's nothing that a man will be able to do that is right enough and acceptable before God on its own merit. Everybody will still need to be saved. They still need the forgiveness of sin. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. Their poison is like the poison of a serpent. They are like deaf cobras that stop its ear, which will not heed the voice of charmers, charming ever so skillfully. So he uses them as examples of those that we might see in nature of animals. They just cannot be tamed. They will not come under the subjection of someone else. So here's what David says: break their teeth in their mouth, O God, and break the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them flow away as waters which run continually. When he bends his bow, let his arrows be cut off into pieces, and let them be like a snail which melts away as it goes, like a stillborn child of a woman, that they may not see the sun. Now, some of that you would be able to say, I get it. Like if somebody wants to shoot an arrow, God, I pray that it doesn't hit its target. That's one thing. But the idea that God would just judge them summarily, like in accordance with what we think is the way it should be, don't expect God to answer that kind of a prayer. What we do know, because I guess we already know, I know what the end of the wicked will be. The Bible tells me that. What my prayer would be is, God, I pray that they don't go the way of the wicked. My prayer is that they would come to know about your mercy and your grace and turn to you. That should be the desire and the prayer of people. Again, we would never want to see the prosperity of the wicked. That would never be the case. What we would pray is that before they are judged for their wickedness, they, like us, would turn from that wickedness and allow God to begin that place of restoration, opening our eyes to our need for forgiveness and for salvation, and turn to him for his mercy and for his grace. That should be the prayer of the believer. Again, his view of things and his understanding of things is different from ours, clearly. So it says, before your pots can feel the burning of thorns, he shall take them away with its whirlwind and his living and burning wrath. Now, the idea here, and again, we can't even understand the phrasing of this. You can read people on this. What does it mean before the thorns? Before your pots can feel the burning thorns, he will take away them with a whirlwind. Nobody understands even the phrasing of that. What is the thorns and what's the pot and everything else? But given the context, it's before these things could come to fruit, God will not let them come to pass. So again, these are idioms that would be understood more than likely by the people who were there. There's disagreement in different scholars of what this term means, or is it even a mistranslation? Some even posit that. I tend to shy away from those kinds of beliefs because that would be a corruption potentially of God's word itself. Perhaps it's more of an idiom that was more understandable to them, but the context makes it pretty obvious. Before what they want to do comes to fruit, God expose it so that it doesn't have the ability to happen as they desire it to be. So again, context makes it where we can just stick with, well, I understand, I may not understand the exact words, but I understand the thought behind it. Don't let it come to pass. So before your pots can feel the burning thorns, he will take them away as with the whirlwind. So before they can come to pass, God will take them away, as is his living and burning wrath, rather. So it says, the righteous, by contrast, the righteous will rejoice when he sees the vengeance, and he shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked, so that men will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous, and surely he is God who judges in the earth. Now again, from David's perspective, if people fail in that, David would say that that is a way that we can prove that we would be able to be on the right side of a situation, they would be on the wrong side, because God would judge them and they would be destroyed before they could do what they want to do, and that people would see that the righteous remain and that the wicked are judged. So again, this is David just basically saying, let this be something that the world would know who it is that you have come to their aid, as opposed to those whose work you have thwarted. Now we get that, we understand that part of it. So again, we would want to say, in that same kind of an idea, when the wicked rise up to do the things that they do, God, we pray that you would defeat that work, and that those who walk rightly before you would be seen in the eyes of the people, that you have shown them favor where you have thwarted the work of those who are evil. That we can all agree upon. What we never want to get to the point of saying, God, I want to rejoice when I see you take vengeance at people. Now, David, I guess if we were able to talk to him, and again, depending on how we read this, the language does seem to be pretty consistent, though. David wanted to see triumph over his enemies, that people would be able to see it, and he uses the word of vengeance here in that kind of sense. Lord, that God, you would be the one who does this thing. He sees it as a matter of vengeance. Again, I never want to take any kind of pleasure in watching those who oppose me or the Lord destroyed. I would rather see that they come to forgiveness. That's what we would desire to see. But ultimately, we do want to be able to agree upon this. When it's all said and done, I want people to be able to see that God has done this thing and it's pleasing to him. I want people to be able to recognize that God has come to the assistance on those who trust him, that they might want the same thing. If I ever find myself in a place of distress, I would want God to come to my assistance as well. That would be our prayer. That's what we would want to be able to see. So again, it's different. It's a different world 3,000 years ago, the way that David sees things, and what we walk in is the way of grace. Let's remember, human nature is to say, I've been wronged. I want my pound of flesh. I pray that they would be broken and crushed and ruined and destroyed. That's human nature. That's not what God's called us to. We would want to be able to say, that's going to be the case with them anyway. God's going to ultimately destroy the wicked. I would pray that they would not be wicked, but they would come to an understanding of the love of God and his mercy and his grace. That's really where our heart should be when we're praying for these things. Even if we have been wronged, I don't want to keep record of that. I expect people to wrong me. It's what the world does. Even if there are people who are in the church and they have wronged me, I expect that. People do what people do. I would rather see that God works in their lives and they come to an understanding of what they've done that's wrong, and they reconcile that between them and the Lord. I don't matter in this. Let them work that out with the Lord, because ultimately they answer to him and to him alone, not to me. So really good things that we learned from this, not only from where David was, but it does, I think, help to kind of put into focus how different the world looks through our eyes because of what we know of the forgiveness and the love of God shown to us in the person of Jesus. A little bit of a different world when we think of it in those terms. So we will pick up at Psalm 59 next week as we work our way through the Psalms. And just if you anything that I've covered in this that you have any questions about, contact us through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, and there's an email form there, and we love hearing from you. If you have questions, let us know, and be happy to answer those as we go along. So we'll pick up at Psalm 59 next week.